Thank you for being here. I value your time. There's lots of great sessions out there you could be in for the last session prior to the keynote, and I appreciate you coming and spending some time with me today. A little bit about myself. Well, first of all, Ventures in Test-Driven Development. If that's where you wanted to be, you're in the right place. A little bit about me. My name is Jeremy Lund. I currently am employed by Workfront. It's one of the booths out here. I'm the principal engineer there, focused as the front-end architect. So I get to work on a lot of the cool front-end problems. I think that's where a lot of the interesting problems are happening nowadays, and I'm sure a number of you do as well, which is why you're in the JavaScript space, I'd hope, to solve those cool problems out there. Family guy, got 4 children, wonderful. I'm kind of missing them. I've been here for a few days now. Our office is out of Utah, so I've been a little ways away from them, but thank goodness we have great technology like Google Hangouts and things like that to be able to stay in touch. One of my big passions is clean, well-tested code. And you can contact me or feel free to follow me. Jeremy Lund is my Twitter handle, and London, that's a 0, not an O, is my GitHub repository. This slide deck, I'll have a link there shortly after the talk, as well as the code samples that we go over and develop during this talk will also be posted there as well. I say I like clean, well-tested code, but that wasn't always the case. I liked clean code, but testing is something that was kind of an acquired taste. Let me go back a little bit in time to my life-changing event that caused me to think about considering doing test. Well, whoops, that's the wrong GIF. Let's go. It's a little bit more like this, a little more realistic. Batman running behind a green screen just doesn't quite get it. It's more like this. See, I was called onto a contract as an architect to help a software team put together a product. So I taught them everything I knew. I put all the things together. This was a Java Spring-based application, putting things together, put the code samples together, how to use things like JDBC templates, and how to dependency inject. I even had some sample tests out there. And I said, okay, go ahead, go forth. You can build the rest of this application. Well, I was involved as kind of a mentor and just an advisor. So I would talk to them periodically. Everything's kind of going okay. And then they decided to pull me in on the project. They were like, Jeremy, you're going to find this a little funny, but we've run into some problems. We've got all these different things that are broken on the website. They're not working. And guess what? We know you provided some sample tests on how to put things together, but we haven't been writing tests on the things that we put together. Not to mention, this was a few years ago. I think we say the same thing about Internet Explorer 8 today, but IE6 doesn't work with this application as well. And just was terrible. So I'll go away from that picture, but yeah, I don't know, IE6 makes my face melt sometimes as well. So they called me in and said, we want you to help fix the problems. Well, remember, we didn't have those tests. It became very painful to go in and make things. It feels like, stepping on a slug or something. You step on it and 2 kind of come out. Or slaying the head on a hydra. Every change became something like this. Note that this bag is not a mock. This is the real thing. So you're playing this little bit of a roulette every time you try to make a change on the application. You have a large code base. Every time you make a little change, you're not sure how it's going to turn out. Sometimes it's successful, and other times, just like Indiana Jones on his first crusade there through that tomb with getting that idol, you have a big rolling ball going after you, which means in real life, in our work environment, it means long hours. It means headaches. It means phone calls or messages at inconvenient times. I like the peaceful, well-balanced life. Like I said, I'm a family man. I like to do things outside of work. I don't live for work. I work so that I can enjoy some of the other things. Although I'm very passionate about what I do, I don't want to be in the office all the time. I have lots of other things to do. So I feel like I know better now what I should be doing. I believe that unit testing by itself is good, and I believe test-driven development can provide some additional value. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go through what a test-driven development experience looks like. First of all, who unit tests their code now? By raise of hands. Okay, so it looks like third, about half. Anybody say that they would use TDD in building those features out. Do they implement TDD in their stuff? Okay, still a few hands. Very good. Hopefully this isn't too much of a review, but I want to convince you first of all that testing is very, very important in our code. It's a necessary thing in my mind. In fact, when I build features now, I have to have tests. Even if the code base has no tests, I have to start writing tests on the things that I'm building. Why would I do that? First of all, this is my one obligatory bullet point slide. I'm not a fan of bullet points, so bear with me here. First of all, I believe it's your job to write tests. As a software engineer, what's our goal? Our goal is to write functioning software, software that meets the requirements of our customers and our clients. One way to do that is, of course, run it through the happy path. You'll open it up in a browser or execute the node process or whatever it is. We click around or put a couple of commands in. Oh, it magically works. Well, that works in the happy path, but really if we want to have empirical evidence that our code meets the requirements of the customer, unit tests can provide that value. Second thing, and I think TDD really plays into this factor here, it clarifies your API and your design. Your tests become the first consumer of your code, of that API, of that software. And so I don't know if you've gone into, I've done this before, spent a week writing something, putting it together, and the next week giving it to somebody and say, here you go, here's the nice thing that you were looking for. And they're like, this is terrible. This API is horrible. It's painful to work with. But after spending a week of investment in that code, kind of married to that code. You're offended because you put your blood, sweat, and tears into that code. So, of course, everybody bears with it. They maybe mutter your name under their breath when they have to work in that section of the application or work with that particular library. By using tests to help clarify the API design, we have ownership over that API, and we're able to figure out what would be the API that I would want to use. How would I want to interact with this system that I'm building and be able to do our test that way. It also provides good documentation on that as well. Somebody can kind of see and demonstrate how to use your API. I believe your code's more resilient to change and refactoring as well. That's one of the mantras of TDD, as well as we'll look at the steps in the next slide, is we're able to make changes, do little refactorings, make improvements, enhancements, whether that's for performance or clarity, and we've got this safety net underneath us, our suite of tests. And finally, we oftentimes spend more time fixing the problems and not the symptoms. I don't know if you've experienced this before, but I've had problems in a root object or service, and those problems, imagine you're on a website, you're working 3 levels down on this particular API. The problem is down in this API, maybe way down in your service layer, but yet the problems are exposed where? On the web page. The links aren't formatted properly, or this particular, your currency is not being displayed correctly. So people will fix the problems up there in the surface area, wherever it cropped up, and it might be 10 different places that they apply fixes where really the problem wasn't up there in the UI, it was clear down in the service level. By writing the unit tests along with that, we're fixing the problem where it actually surfaced, not fixing all the different symptoms that particular issue may have caused. So the test-driven development cycle adds 3 different things: red, green, refactor. What do I mean by each of those? First of all, you write a failing test. You start with the test first. You may have heard this called test-first development as well. You start with the failing test. You watch it fail in spectacular fashion. It's okay, because you're going to quickly fix it. Making the test pass isn't writing the entire application so that it passes. It's writing the minimum amount of code to ensure that the test that the test passes. That might be 1 line of code. It might be adding a variable somewhere. It's just enough to make the test pass, and then you make it better. You refactor it. And then you go through this cycle again. And first you may be starting with some fake constants or something else, but over time you write additional tests to help surface more of the features and help build out your design. And you just keep going through that cycle. The second thing I want to talk about, there's 3 things we're going to talk about here. First of all was that cycle that we're going to need to know about. Second thing is the punch list. The punch list becomes like a to-do list. I don't know if you've worked with a contractor or a builder. Usually when they're finishing up a project, they have something called a punch list. And these are like the final items that need to be done in order to basically sign off on the build. We can use a punch list very much in the same way for us. We have our list of to-do items. If you read Kent Beck's books on TDD, he talks about writing them down on a notepad next to his desk. For JavaScript testing, I tend to use my Jasmine or Mocha test definitions, and I'll use those as the placeholders to let me know what I need to work on. And the important thing with this punch list isn't we have to come up with an exhaustive list of items that we need to implement in the beginning. What we do is we come up with a general idea of what we think we need so far, and as we break down the problem into smaller problems, we start completing these tests. And when we come across something and we go, oh, we've got to put that in place, we don't necessarily turn from our current test and start working on that test. Instead, we just simply add it to the list and go, that's something I need to capture and then eventually implement. And so it allows us to stay focused. Our punch list is very important because we can focus our attention on one thing at a time, get that done, and once we get that one succeeding, we can go on to the next item. Finally, the last thing that we need to do is what actually goes inside one of these tests. There's three different terms that people, or two different sets of terms that people use for this writing a test. The first one I think of as the AAA, and we're not talking about the auto thing, but arrange, act, and assert. The idea here is arrange is setting up your test, preparing things into a known state so that you can then perform your test. The act is the actual operation or operations that you need to do in the test. Call your service method or your function that you've prepared. And assert, of course, is the evaluation of those results to see is it in the correct state after the action has taken place and any other items that you need to evaluate. This is really important as you're writing your test because then you can construct the items in order and keep them organized in there. Another thing that people use, a set of terms that people use when they talk about these three items is given, when, then. Given these conditions are true, when I do this, then these things should happen. So you might have heard it both ways. It's just a different set of terms for those, just to keep it aligned. Whatever terms you want to use, it's okay. You can pick your set, but I've found it really valuable to organize those into those three groups. So with that background in mind, let's go ahead and start doing a little bit of coding. I want to take this time to just show how simple it can be to just kind of get started and going. I've done a little bit of pre-baking before we go to the IDE, and it's basically these four commands here that I've run. I've installed the Karma CLI. This allows you to run that fourth command, Karma init, which does some reasonable defaults for you as you're initializing your Karma test configuration environment. The npm init's there simply to get a base package JSON file together so that as I install additional node packages that they can be saved. Then I installed Karma. You've got to install it inside your project so it knows which version to use. The -D is just a shortcut to save that as a dev dependency. Talking npm is a little outside the scope of this talk, but if you have questions later on how to get it set up, just feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to help you with this. So that's what we're going to start with. And we're going to go back one slide because that's the last slide. Let's go to an editor. So first of all, I do have a Karma configuration here, but I think it's valuable to just quickly go through an example of what that looks like when we run Karma init. So I've already, I know that this is a little small over here, but you can see I've got a number of dependencies, Karma, Jasmine, Firefox, etc. We'll run a Karma init here and you just see how it works here. So first of all, ask which testing framework you want to use. My personal preference is Mocha. I really like Mocha and Chai together, but the default one's Jasmine. It's kind of simple and basic. The important thing is to pick one that works best for you and use it and write the test. So I'm going to use Jasmine. I'm not using require.js on this particular project, so I'll continue. Then it'll ask you if you want to capture any browsers. This one here, you can enter multiple browsers. The one I'm using today is Firefox. I generally use Chrome or Phantom. Phantom is a little deficient on some of the current standards that are available, and so you'll find certain features of the DOM don't work with it. And Chrome will only run if it's focused on your screen, and I don't want it stomping over our tests all day. Firefox fits the bill for this, so we'll go ahead and do that. And then the location of our test files. We don't have any test files yet, but when we do, or our source files, they're all going to be in source/star.js, and it warns me that there's nothing there. Of course not, I haven't written any tests yet, right? So we'll move on. The default should be fine there. Sure, I want it to watch. And then we'll create a file similar to this. Bring that back down and out of the way. So it creates a file like this, just a set of configuration files. The defaults are usually just fine. If you're trying to integrate into your existing project, you'll want to learn about these configuration settings. But starting a basic project like this, the defaults work great. You can see it's monitoring our files using Jasmine, and there's just some other things in here. So let's go ahead and kick this off. The way you run Karma generally is you'll run Karma start. And this is an error. We have no tests. That's what we expected. But what we do know is we've got Firefox running over here connected to our Karma system in the background, off screen. And we really don't need to pay any attention to it. It's there just to execute our tests against. The important thing with Karma is that it runs against browsers, that it captures browsers and executes against them. That's pretty important in my mind when you're writing stuff that's going to be consumed in a browser to make sure that it runs effectively. That's a great thing here. And the thing that we're actually going to build is we're going to build a little blind component. A blind component, you've probably seen those before. Sometimes they're called an accordion. Just a really simple DOM component, and work through that in a TDD fashion. And it's important that we have the browser set up to be able to do that. So let's start with a test. New file, let's call it, well, it's going to be blind, so we'll call it blindspec.js. And we won't worry about that. And you'll notice I've got an auto watcher running here, so it's going to run our tests multiple times, and then when we have file changes that match the file, any of the file patterns that we have, the glob patterns, it will go ahead and re-execute the tests. So we'll add describe. Describe is a way to organize our tests. It's really primarily an organizational strategy to kind of group tests by functionality or whatever other configuration you want. The primary tests here, see we still have no tests with that, are these it commands, and usually it's like it should do this, it should behave this way, it should contain this, followed by a function that contains our arrange, act, assert that we talked about earlier. So let's see, a blind, what's a couple of things we might need? We're using these it statements to kind of form our punch list. Well, one of them might be it should have a blind defined. It's got to be available. Let's see, a couple things I can think of. It should have a container, something to contain it. So what we're going to do is have something like this, where we have these divs here with a title attribute and some content, and we want those to be turned into a section that has a clickable title. When you click on it, it will open. When you click on it again, it will collapse. So we're just going to kind of take these elements like that. So let's, so it should have a container, and then finally, let's see. We know it should click, so let's see. It should open when I click the title. Sounds like a list here. So we got 3 items. Now notice they're skipped. By default, when you don't have a function argument in your Jasmine test, it's going, and Mocha does the same thing with this. It treats it as a pending test, which is great for our punch list because we can say, hey, here's the things we still need to implement that we haven't done anything with yet. So let's go ahead and get started with something. With the blind defined, we are going to have something, if we look at our index here, we want something kind of like something that's just on the window object called blind that we can put on the element, call against that element, and it will create the blind out of it. So let's expect window.blind to be defined. And we can see that that test fails. Well, what's the simplest way that we can fix it? I'm going to create a separate file here. We could put our implementation in this test file as well. That would be okay. I'm just going to separate it just for the purposes of this. And what I want to do, I've got enough room here. I will split this vertically. So we'll keep our tests here and we'll keep our implementation. So let's go window blind equals just some function. and we can see our test is failing, or excuse me, succeeding. It's not doing anything useful yet, but these are all about little steps. So the next thing here, let's see, it should have a container. I'm going to use, for my container, for this particular implementation, rather than using the display none and display block to kind of show and hide it, I'd prefer to leave that in the hands of the designer. So with this one, I'm going to use the existence of classes to determine visibility. Who's heard of the BEM notation or style block element modifier? I'm going to go ahead and use that for this. So those who haven't heard of it before, it's just similar to this, where you have your block, my component is blind, and then you identify elements with a double underscore in between. So there will be a blind title element. These are things later, and then a blind contents, and then the modifier is with the hyphens, and it tells it the state. So by defining things in these clearly organized things, we can leave the visual changes and styling in the hands of the designer, but it still allows me to have a reliable way within my test to determine what the state is of this component at any given time. So let's add the container. And so our root container there, we need to have that. How we identify the container, of course, is having that block level class on it. So let's, first of all, we have to be able to, we have this expect, let's see. So we have our blind element to, and we'll say it's class list, newer element to contain blind. But we're failing because we don't have a blind element defined. What is the blind element that we're looking for? Well, we need to be able to add a sample element to the DOM, be able to evaluate it. So we're going to add an additional function here. Before each is a function it adds for being able to do kind of a setup, tear down functionality. There's an after each as well. We're going to need that as well. And what we're going to do is just set aside a little container for holding these elements as we add them, because of course our teardown, we want to take those elements back out of the DOM. We don't, a test should run independently, each of these unit tests should run independently of one another, and they should leave everything kind of in a clean state. So we'll create an element, and we're going to go old school here. I didn't want to favor any particular framework. At work, we primarily use Angular. We're looking at React on some things, but oops, that's not what I wanted. Document, body, and we'll just append it to the DOM. Once you use this base DOM manipulation like this, you can imagine why jQuery and other things were created. Anyway, it gets a little verbose. And then at the end of the test, we're going to, oh, actually, I think it's that. I think I did that right. No, I didn't. And we'll just, okay. So of course we're still failing because we're just adding a container to put this in. So we need a little element. This will be our blind element equals, blind element equals document. We'll create something real simple, create element. We'll just make it a div. And then what we expect to be able to do is to take that element, oh, we've got to add it to our container. We'll append it to that container. So it's on the page, and we save that, we're still failing. What we want to do is run our little blind function that we had here. We expect to run blind on that blind element. The blind leading the blind. Anyway, let's see, blind element. And then we want to be able to, we need the function to be able to add that class on it. So let's pass the element in on our component over here on the right, and then we'll just see class list we'll add blind to it. So we'll just take whatever element we got and add blind to it. And let's see, a blind should have a container failed. What am I failing on? Sorry? Oh, whoops. Let's see here. That's what I meant. Yeah, thank you. All right, so success. And if we ever want to kind of look at stuff and see if it works okay, of course we can do a console log out here and kind of look at, sometimes valuable to see what the container looks like. We see here we just got a blind div, nothing fancy, but we haven't got a content that we're opening, we don't have the title on or anything like that. So let's do a little bit more here. Let's see. Open when I click the title. Well, one thing we don't have right now is we don't have a title, so we probably need to add the title before we try to solve this particular test. We have one we're skipping, so let's just, like, it should have a title. Okay, so let's see. How do you find that? In our kind of sample API that we were thinking of when we were exploring how to do this, we decided, well, maybe a title attribute, which is on nearly any HTML element, we could use that title and we could create an element with this as the content. So let's set up something with that. One thing you'll notice here as we create this is, well, and I'm going to copy and paste, which is a sign that we probably need to do some refactoring soon because I have some duplication there. And this one, of course, the blind element, we'll add a set attribute of title, and we'll just say this is the title. Okay, and I should have probably written my expectation first, but let's think about this for a minute. So we have the title. Well, title, we could put that inside the container we have now, but where are we going to put the content? So really, there's a little bit of manipulation we might need to do with the divs. We might have 2 or 3 divs that we're talking about here for this blind container. But let's just forget that for a minute. This is the simplest thing we need to do to make this work. So let's say we want to, let's see, we already appended it. So we want to expect the blind elements text content. So we'll just put it right in that div we have now to be, this is the title. So we're just going to have, just inside that div, we got the class blind on it, and then we're putting the content in. Save it, and that's failing. We expect a blank to be this is the title. So let's make this work. Well, the simplest possible thing we can do is we passed in an element with a title attribute on it. So let's go text content equals element.get attribute title. And it's still not working. I did something wrong. Let's see here. Set attribute. Don't you love live coding? Let's see here. Actually, I had this working perfectly yesterday. Let's see, text content element. Blind element, title, this is initialize. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I didn't do the act. That's arrange act assert. There you go. Thank you. I was just freezing up there for a minute. Let's see. So we have a title in there, but if we looked at the content again, just the container inner HTML. This still isn't the container we want. We've got this content in here, but we have nowhere to put it like a content pane. So let's work on that for a little bit. But first of all, let's move some of this up into a reusable thing, because writing this stuff, this is duplication over and over again. We're setting up all these attributes on this blind, and really we could consolidate them into one thing. So let's really quickly move some of this up into an element. Put that up here, and we'll always append it. I like the stuff of modifying the blind element together, so we'll just move that there, and then we'll create our variable outside, just so that you can have as many of these before each's as you want. When you're writing unit tests, you really shouldn't care the order on what they run independently of each other, but it's kind of nice to have multiple before eaches to kind of group suites of functionality. So if you wanted to take that before each and nest certain ones inside a describe or something else, and they're really easy to move. So we'll go ahead and move that reusable functionality up. And actually, we're even going to take the blind's duplication so that I don't make the mistake I did just a minute ago again. So we've been able to move the arrange and act basically up into this before each for this section, which makes it a little easier to iterate over a design, and all our tests are still passing. That's another important thing. Every time you make these little changes, you want to verify that things are still working, that you're in a known state. That way you know the target you need. Now that we have that, what I want to do is I want to be able to make our title element. I want to move it into kind of a nested level. So we need to do a little bit of DOM manipulation. So what I'm saying here is like this div here. Let's take that one for example. We want it to look something like this when we're done here. Oh, whoops. Forgetting my emmet for a little bit there. So class blind, we want a div blind title that would have this is the title. This is the clickable region, of course. That's kind of how we want things set up. This will be our next step. Eventually, we're going to have that content panel down in here too, because we got to do something with that. But let's just start with that. So this is our target. So let's add, this will be our blind container equals document create element. And this is where the blind element needs. Again, we need it on there. And then let's create an element for the title in here. This is a little bit bigger jump than normally make on some of these, but we're going to press forward. Div, and we'll go ahead and append. Oops. I always get those arguments backwards. Append child blind title. And then this here is our blind title. So let's, whoops. Okay, so we have our title, we have our container that we just created. And we have our element. The container we're kind of throwing away for now. That was the element that came in. Notice that we're not using it there, but we actually have to take the, if we're going to do that, we have to take the element that was in, that's where it was in the correct place in the DOM, and we have to replace it with our container, right? So there is an element that we can use for that. We've got this little piece together. Let's say element, replace, let's see, element parent, node, replace child. Our new child is going to be our blind container, and our old one is going to be element coming in. And we should have, oh, we're only supposed to have one test fail. That's why I did jump a little bit too much in here, so with what I did. The reason why is blind element is our container, but the one that we're getting in the node now isn't the same element. It's a parent one that's been added in there. So really what I should be doing here, let's fix these really quick. Let's see, container. I love these functions. If there's some blogs out there like you might not need jQuery. I don't know if you've seen those, but document query selector all, document query selector are available from IE8 on up. They're really useful, and they got me away from a lot of the stuff that I've used jQuery for in the past. Those are available for you if you need them. What we're going to do is actually, we want to see that the child node, it's the first child node, the class, so this will be the nested one in our container. So that should fix that one, it did. So the container is like our test container one. The first child should be our new blind component, and we're looking at the class list to make sure it has blind on it. And then the title should be nested under that container. So we'll go ahead and use query selector on this one, and we'll go blind, and with that we'll just grab the first element off of that by doing that. And the first element off there because we want the first node under our blind component. We want to just check the text content. That's right. And oh boy, let's see here. This means I made too many changes at once. That's what I meant. Container. All right. I apologize. This is okay. Well, we're going to do this simpler. Child nodes. I prefer the query selector, but that got us passing. So we're going 2 levels down. I don't know what was going on with my query selector, but it's working now. So what we have now is we know that the element, going back to our index, we have the blind element here. We've got the title in the right place. So we've got a configuration kind of like this. Now we want to put our content in here. And following our BEM notation, we kind of like to have something like this. This is the content 1. So kind of similar to what we've done on these other ones here. We want something like that. So we need to add our content in there, but that's implementation. Let's get a test first. So should have a content panel. Okay, and so we've already added our components in here. We probably ought to, for this test, for our sample element that we've been adding to decorate, we should probably be adding the content that we want in there so that it's available for our component to take and decorate. And get that in place. So now we've got that item added. We've run blind on it. What do we want to assert here? We want to see that what we expect in our thing, if we look at the ordering, we expect that title should be first in there and the content after, which is really important. If somebody's going to style that, they know which ones are which, so they're not having to do a lot of positioning or anything. So child nodes 0, and I'm just going to brute force these ones because we know it works. And then, of course, we can refactor and make it better later. So we got our text content, and let's take that content. This is our target. We want to make sure that content element has that in there, and we've got a failure again. So let's see here. Well, we have our container. We've got a pattern for how we've done this with the blind title. Maybe we can just go blind container, append child, element. And, I really should rename that blind content. It's bugging me. Okay, that's not what I should have done. Okay, we'll just keep it there. Little steps. 4 failed. Append child elements. Oh, I've got to do this actually. Sorry, I've got to do that after I replace the child so that it can be extracted out. So there we go. So what I had to do is wait until I had replaced the child in the tree before I moved it in. So what we have now is we have something just like this structure here where we have the content in there. So we got a nice structure set up, but we haven't added, we don't have that content class. Let's add that as part of this test. Normally I'd put this in a separate test, but we're just going to scroll over to another screen for some reason. Let's see. Class list. Let's add it here. I normally don't like to have more than one assert in the test, simply because if it breaks on an earlier one, you don't know where the other one's passed, and it might be masking additional issues. But we're going to do that. We're going to shortcut it here for this. Blind content. Oh, we don't have a content on there. So what can we do? With that element we had, the shortest possible fix is to set attribute, or actually let's do class list. I love the class list parameter. It works great. I think it's only IE 10 on up though for that particular one, unfortunately. Okay, just simple change. I should have been checking the title style here too. We'll just do that while we're thinking about it. Again, that probably would be best in another test, but we're going to just add it here. Because we added a style to blind, but we didn't add it to our title. That's going to be important when we're clicking on it and verifying states of things. So we want to have blind title. We have a test failing, expected to contain blind title. So we can kind of do the same thing. Let's duplicate this blind content, move it up to our title element, and put that as part of the construction of our title. And of course we need to change it to the right class name on there as well. And that passes. This is how you keep working through these. You just keep working these short, minuscule changes. Yeah, we've probably written these blind things multiple times, accordions, whatever you want to call them. But test-driven works really effectively here. One thing I want to do really quick before I continue is I'm going to add something I think is important. Yes, I know my subscription needs to be upgraded. Let's see here, unshelve. I'm going to unshelve a couple of things. Hopefully I got just a second here. It's because I went through and modified my karma config again, so let me just, we're going to unshelve that. I'm going to kick off my karma tests again. One thing you'll notice here, what I added was coverage support. So karma coverage is really useful. It runs Istanbul, which instruments your tests. And you can see here that we're getting high degree of coverage. One of the things I really like about TDD is you have high degree of coverage. Coverage is only one metric, right, on our code. You shouldn't rely on that. Oh, I have 100% coverage, therefore my code is awesome. It just means all your code was reachable by something somewhere along the way, right? What I like about TDD is I only add a line to solve a test, to meet a test. And so you usually have a high degree of coverage by doing that. So we're going to just let that run as we're going and making changes now, and you can kind of see how that impacts it. So let's see, we have our content panel. Just really quick, let's just look at what our stuff looks like. Container, inner, HTML. Okay, so we have our blind title structure, and we have our blind content. This kind of looks like what we were expecting at this point, so I'm feeling pretty good about what I have. In fact, if we wanted to go and serve this, oops, I know I've got, let's exit out of that for a minute. You can see that we've styled one of them here, or that's the example one. I'm not calling blind on those other ones, but you can see that it's looking correct. It's doing the right thing. So that's good. At least it looks like, oh, that's what it was just working great on my sample that we put together. Okay, that's better. Those ones right there are the 5 that we were running the blind thing on. This was just our prototype that we were putting together. So you can see that it's actually structured things correctly. The styling is what I would expect on those items. I'm going to remove that sample item down here. But we have a problem. It's showing the content all the time. We don't really want that. We want it to be able to be clickable. So let's get to and of course we have a test left to do. Let's see, it should open when we have the title. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's see. So we should be able to take, let's say the container, actually let's do it like this. Let's go document, query selector, and we want to click on it. When we click on it, we expect the blind content item, expect the class list to contain blind content open. Okay, so that's kind of our goal. When we click on it, it should be open. And when we save and go over to our tests here, we have one test failing. Let's see. Expected blind content to contain it. Well, let's do that. What's the minimum amount? We want to have on our blind title, we'll add an event listener. We'll say when we click on it, we want to do a blind, let's see, left that element. Class list, add. You guys are probably already seeing a problem with this, but we'll fix that soon enough. Again, minimum amount of code to solve the problem at hand. Because of course if we click on it twice, we don't have any state change here. But that did serve us a couple more tests. What I was thinking, we have that test passing. Great, it's clicking on it. In fact, if we go to our browser just to look at this, it doesn't do anything because, well, it didn't have a closed thing on it too. So we need to add, we should really add one. It should originally be closed. What's the definition of closed on this? Well, we can take this one right here. Really, using the BEM notation we've been using, it really should be that it has a closed property on it when it's initially set up. And I need document, not that other thing. Let's see here. And something, I'm missing a before statement. Oh, thank you. Wow. Okay. Oh, I'd cut it off even more. It was just that part. Okay, cool. So it's failing. Why is it failing? Because it doesn't have closed, which is what we expect. So let's just add here. This add will take more than one item, which I really like. So we'll just, to our content, initially we'll add closed. And we're working great again. So we have the click working. But there's another test that we should probably do around this state. We know initially it's closed. When we click on it, it opens up. But we probably should test when we close it again that it does the right thing, or click it again. So it should close when I click it twice. Okay, so let's click it twice, and then we expect it to be closed. And that shouldn't have worked, but it did. Any ideas why that worked? An inspection on there, so what ends up happening if we look at the element here, again, sometimes just console logging stuff out, still your friend, and it's okay. I won't think poorly of you if you use console log. What's that? Yes, that's exactly right. So if we look at that, we have blind title, and we have closed, and we have open. We didn't take care of all the details on what open means, which means that I didn't write my test very well on the open. I should have been saying on the open that open is not only adding the open class but the absence of the closed class. So yeah, if we add that to our test here, then to not contain, so we can see here when we contain, it should contain open and not closed, but we fail because it's not to contain closed. So what we should have been doing here, there's a nice function, just for sake of time I'm going to go ahead and add it in here because the add would have the same problem, is there's toggles. So you can toggle. I really like this function on class list because then if it's on there, it takes it off. If it's not on there, it puts it on. Very convenient. I don't have to, it's some of the state that I would normally have to keep track of and go, hey, see if this element's on here. It takes care of it. So by doing that, we should be flipping those two. So when I click it the first time, this should show up, and this one should be removed because we're toggling it off, and then vice versa. So let's save stuff, and it's all working beautifully. And if we were to complete our test here, really this one should also not contain open. So we're kind of running short on time, but imagine if your client or customer came up to you and said, okay, this blind component that is not working for some reason. That's not good. See, make sure I've got it loading correctly. Source blind. I renamed a bunch of stuff right before. That wasn't very smart. I'm not sure why. Oh, you know what? I don't know if I have it. Do I have it running still? I do. What's that? I did. So the click there should have done that.
You have the contents.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, normally I'd write the consumer after thank you. Look at that. You guys are really good. You guys must be really good at those Where's Waldo and stuff. You guys are seeing stuff. That's awesome. I need somebody like that everywhere here, you know, kind of like Johnny Carson had Ed McMahon. Not that I'd be more Ed McMahon, but anyway, regardless, you know, have either one. That would be great. Maybe Paul Schaefer with more hair. So these are working great, but maybe your client comes to you a week or so later. Hey, I love those things. They start closed. I can click on them. They're great, but they might come to you and say, well, maybe I want one to start open. Can you add something to be able to start it open? Or maybe they come to you and go, I only want one open at any time. I want to turn those into more of an accordion thing where as they go through the panels, they click on them. Or they might even go, you know, based on the hash in the address bar, I want a certain one to open that matches with that ID or something. Do you have a general idea of how you might start to tackle one of those using these kind of tests? I mean, if you figure out, the basic principle here is you take that API, or you take your problem, you figure out what your API is going to be in here, and then you test those conditions. The code that I'll be shipping out on the GitHub repository does have that where it's initially, you can set it to be initially opened or initially closed based on a flag, just using a data attribute. That was the option I decided to use to set that state. But I just set up a couple of more tests. I go, hey, when this is true, set it to open. But like I said, we're running a little bit low on time. If there aren't any questions, I might be able to get to it. But anyway, let's go back to, actually, I don't really have any other slides. Do you guys have any questions for me on what I've gone over? Questions, ideas that you've had as you've gone through TDD for how to do these things? Yes?
Starting with TDD, where we actually do to be defined, and then we also then test the type. So when you first start out, it's like you're saying that X is defined, say equal null, define done.
Right.
Then you check to say, is it a function?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that's something that, for starters,
Right.
is an idea. And then in the long run, you can actually, once you get used to it, move away from the to be defined, and then just start writing to be a function or to be an object.
Right, that's a good point. So what he's pointing out, just the observation there is, when my very first test was to see that this is to be defined. At his work, they also test for the type of the item. So we test maybe that it was actually a function rather than that. And one thing I wanted to point out with these two is some of these tests don't feel like you have to keep all the tests too. This is a test that probably at this point is kind of an implied test based on the other one, so I could probably go like that. Feel free to delete tests over time if you need to, but yeah, that's a good point going through there. I did make a little bit of a leap there by just saying, okay, it's not only defined, it's actually a function and just moving on. So any other comments, questions, observations? Do you think this is something you could go ahead and start doing in your own work? Maybe? Okay, good. Like I said, getting started, I don't want people to get hung up on, I think sometimes in the community we get hung up on tools and how they work. Tools should make us more productive, but sometimes, I don't know if you're like me, sometimes I spend more time fiddling with my tools. And I don't even use Vim, but I mean, people spend so much time tuning their tools, and it's something that you use all the time, but they'll do that before they even get started writing a line of code ever and seeing if their current configuration works. With this, try something simple. I mean, Karma with Jasmine is a great solution. Like I said, I prefer Mocha and Chai just because it has a richer assertion framework. That's really the only reason I prefer that over the other one. Jasmine 2 and Mocha, for all intents and purposes, are very, very similar in how they run stuff. But anyway, I appreciate your time coming here and listening to me go on, helping me fix some of my mistakes as I go through and test drive together. Just feel free to contact me using any of the methods above if you have questions or comments or feedback later. And of course, the feedback forum at Midwest.js. I'd appreciate your feedback on what worked well, what could be improved upon. And I will put out on the Twitter feed once I have the slide deck link available, as well as the code sample, so that you can go ahead and walk through it yourself. What I'll actually do with that is in the README provide the instructions for kind of going through the TDD kata, if you will, to get that component built. So anyway, thank you for your time.